Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. You know, we often imagine the quintessential Civil War military men as brave boys marching off from home in brand new uniforms with gleaming rifled muskets and glinting bayonets. They're filled with romantic ideas of battle and go on to commit courageous acts of gallantry in the thick of combat and against a hail of artillery. In fact, I've told many such stories here, but not all military men were young, and not every piece of equipment was brand new, state of the art. Today's story is about a warship and an old officer, both coming out of retirement to fight the Civil War. First, the ship. At the beginning of the war, the U.S. Navy did not have the vessels or the seasoned sailors for crews to support the massive blockade that stretched down the Atlantic into the Gulf of Mexico and then on the other side of the country along the Pacific coast. If that wasn't enough, there were all the rivers and intercoastal waterways and harbors that needed to be protected. The need was so great that the tiny Navy commissioned whatever it could find, converting massive numbers of civilian vessels to warships and other types of support boats. The Navy also turned to its mothballed fleet of ancient ships that they needed to get back into service. One of them was a 44-gun frigate called the Brandywine. It had first been launched in 1825. It's a good 35 years before the Civil War. On that maiden voyage in 1825, she carried a Revolutionary War hero, Lafayette, home to France after he visited the United States. The Brandywine continued into service until 1850, when her sails were finally furled, thoughtfully, probably, maybe for the last time. Well, it wasn't the last time. The Navy called her back into service. In late September of 1861, according to a report in the New York Tribune, quote, the old frigate Brandywine is being rapidly converted into a store ship, about the only thing she is fit for. When completed, she will present a rather patched appearance, but she will no doubt answer the purpose for which she is intended, end quote. The Brandywine was never going to be out in the front lines. She was too old, needed to be used for something. She could be used for something, and a store ship was the answer. The press wasn't particularly friendly. That Tribune report wasn't particularly nice. Other newspapers took pot shots at the Brandywine, referring to her as the Hulk Brandywine. So that's the story of the Brandywine. I'll come back to her in a little bit. But now let's look at the officer. The new crew of the Brandywine, we needed a crew, even though it was a store ship, included a veteran officer who heard the call to arms and came out of retirement to serve his country. He's pictured here. His name is Samuel Shipley. He was 47 years old. He was a lieutenant, originally from Delaware. He had resigned his commission in 1852, almost 10 years earlier. But you could not keep Shipley away from the sea. In fact, the ocean was his first love. Quote, our subject, end quote, noted the writer of a biographical sketch, quote, when a schoolboy near the Delaware Bay, watching the ships go down to the ocean, early evidenced a desire to go to sea, end quote. The death of Shipley's father, when he was only about 4 years old, prompted his widowed mother, Mary, to relocate to eastern Indiana to be closer to her family. Though there in Indiana, the move took him away from the sea, but in his mind, he was still there. He still loved the ocean. It did not dampen his ambitions. His dreams were realized in 1834 when, thanks to friends and his congressional representative, then young Shipley, received an appointment as a Navy midshipman in the Navy. At this time in America's naval history, young officers received their education entirely on warships, and Shipley started his training on the brig Enterprise. Meanwhile, calls for a formal school led to the establishment of an academy in Philadelphia, and Shipley was a member of the first class to pass examinations there. That was in 1839. Well, the U.S. Naval Academy, the Naval Academy we know today, opened its doors in Annapolis, Maryland, 6 years later. By this time, Shipley had established himself as an up-and-coming officer. Between assignments, he had gone back to Indiana. He married there and fathered a daughter, even purchased a farm. Tragedy struck, though, during the birth of a second child, a son. Shipley's wife, Martha, succumbed to complications, and the infant child also died. Shipley had that remaining child, a surviving daughter, left her in the care of family, and returned to his first love, the sea. With the Navy, he was stationed along the African coast when the War of Mexico erupted in 1846. He remained in Africa until his tour of duty ended in early 1848. The war, meanwhile, was still going on, and Shipley was assigned to serve as a lieutenant aboard a store ship called the Germantown and sailed for Mexican waters. But by the time the vessel arrived in May of 1848, hostilities had ceased and a peace treaty had been signed. Now, in 1852, 4 years later, Shipley resigned his commission due to the effects of fever contracted during his tour of duty in Africa. Down but not out, he returned to Indiana, rejoined his surviving child, and settled into life as a farmer. Now, flash forward 9 years. The war began, and Shipley decided that he was going to get back in. He decided to offer his services to the Navy. On September 25th, 1861, he was reappointed to his old rank and ordered to join the crew of the Brandywine, which was then in New York City, all patched up and ready for action. About a month later, in October of 1861, the old frigate left her moorings at the New York Navy Yard for the first time in more than a decade. She was towed by a side-wheeled steamer to Hampton Roads, Virginia, and deployed as a store ship and a hospital. Now, neither the Brandywine or Shipley would be able to serve out the rest of the war. Shipley remained in the service until 1863. Because of poor health, he was forced to resign. So he was out about halfway through the war. Then, about a year later, in September 1864, the Brandywine sunk at her moorings in Norfolk, gutted by an accidental fire. Shipley returned to Indiana and lived on a farm until his passing in 1897 at age 73. So, thanks for listening to the story of Samuel Shipley and the Brandywine. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on a Civil War Research Trail.